significant surge talents or even crit talents. Crit talents, unintuitively increase the value of crit. They don't decrease it. Um,
Yeah, that's good.
Concealment
Good.
is another example. Those specs, definitely crit becomes a lot more exciting in terms of raising your average DPS. Here's the thing to be worried about, though. When you're in a boss fight, and you're trying to beat that enrage, a difference in mean DPS, so average DPS, over an infinite amount of parsing, um, that is on the order of like 5 DPS, 6 DPS, you are not going to see that in a boss fight. I really don't care how sensitive you are to little tiny fluctuations in boss fights. You're not going to see it. What you're going to see is when your standard deviation, so your variance in your DPS, is really, really high. So for people who remember Arsenal back in the early days of 2.0 and in all of 1.0, for people who remember Vengeance Juggernauts, where you just got unlucky on procs and all of a sudden your DPS dropped by like 600 points, that is what matters for boss fights. And the thing about crit is that unless your native crit chance, so your crit without any crit stat, is really, 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 really high, adding crit rating actually makes your DPS fluctuate more. So there was some really interesting math that was done on the Sage Sork subforum months ago that was looking at this, but it basically, even for classes that see better mean DPS pushing their crit up, they start seeing really significant fluctuations. And sure, that might be something that's actually great on a dummy because you want to trigger those fluctuations, right? You're throwing out everything but your best parse. But on a boss, you don't have the luxury of throwing out everything but your best parse. You're dealing with what you have right now. And so right now, my opinion is actually a little bit opposing to Oofalong's. I think that there are classes that see an average DPS increase from crit, but there's really only one class where I would actively run crit rating on a boss fight. And that would be Virulence. None of the others I would use it.
So how significant do you think, 150 in critical, so let's call it 10% of your stat budget, 150 critical rating is, how much do you think that hinders your ability to clear this boss fight, for example?
I wish I could remember the exact math on it. So 150 crit rating is what? We're talking about like 1.7%,
Yeah,
2%, somewhere in
somewhere.
there?
Yep. Under 2%. I think it's just, 1.6
Yeah,
something or other.
let's call it under 2%. I think it really depends on the boss. There's very few boss fights that have ever been in the game that have a DPS check which is so absurdly tight that that variance is a really significant factor. I think if you go and look at pre-nerf clears, well, pre-nerf clears of Nightmare Dreadguard, you can see very viscerally where variance is a factor. So a really fantastic example of this is Republic Gentleman's pre-nerf clear of Nightmare Dreadguard. Their Gunnery Commando had godlike procs, absolutely godlike procs. And you look at his crit rates on demo round and you're like watching the fly text and holy cow, his Heatseeker missile is critting like 70% of the time. That's a huge variance. That was extremely, like, that was at the extreme high end of what the variance is. You look at some of the other procs and some of the crits that like Wildberry was getting, for example. And you see, like, basically just across the board, they were all hitting like really high end of their variance. And that was why they beat the Enrage. Drop It Like It's Hoth's World First clear, Hatred's clear, like all of those clears, you look at the DPS numbers and you look at like the classes that they were running and what kind of proc rates they were getting, it was all really at the high end of the variance. And people, those same groups, when they had falling at the low end or even at the average part of their variance, they just couldn't clear the boss.
So it was example, go do it, and then get the lucky procs, and yes, it worked.
Yeah, that's what pre-nerf Nightmare Dreadguard was.
That fight was ridiculous. Yeah,
that fight was amazing, but it was ridiculous. Second phase of Nightmare Council, especially before some of the classes got buffed to the crazy extent that they did, that was another one that fell into the category of you kind of needed the high end of your variance to be able to clear that phase, at least for the first time. Second clears, third clears, like farming that boss is actually very easy, but getting that first clear where you just had to be ahead of the DPS check, you had to be able to get your crystals, like all of that stuff, that you kind of needed stuff on the high end of your damage ratios. I remember watching Underworld Alliance's first clear of it, and UWA had some really really good DPS. They had Zedjum, who's now in Zors. They had Farius and Scythus were both on playing Annihilation, and you look at the meters and you look at just like the kind of crits and the kind of just rolls that they were getting on their abilities, proc rates on Zedjum's rail shot, like all of that was just flowing so perfectly, and they got the damage that they needed, and they beat the phase, and they got their first clear. And there are like that's an example of a boss fight where if you geared yourself deliberately for high variance, you would just be rolling the dice on your group. Maybe you needed high variance, and then maybe going for crit would be a good idea, but more often than not, you just want like that. There, you're just trying to get really, really lucky because you need to hit your high variance at the same time that the other three DPS in your group hit their high variance, and that's very, very hard to do. It's generally better to go for reliability.
Okay, so just to clarify, also concerning the bosses, and just bounce back to accuracy really quick. Bosses have 100% defense.
They have a 10% defense chance.
Yeah.
10%, which is why you need 100% on your accuracy.
So accuracy is really interesting.
Yeah, basically break it down. What's the difference currently against bosses between tech and...
Right. So it's more complicated than that, but what confuses a lot of people is when you look at ranged or you look at your melee character sheet, depending on what you are, it says like 90% is your... And that's the one finite number. The one number listed there is 90%, or maybe it's 98 point whatever now because you've got some accuracy rating. If you hover over that, you'll see that is your basic accuracy. Your special attack accuracy is exactly the same as your force and tech accuracy. So your special and then your force and tech start at 100% accuracy. And so what you're doing is you're trying to build those up to 110%, and that extra 10% overcomes the boss's 10% defense chance. Every attack or ability that you have in the game, with the exception of your basic attack and offhand attacks, goes off of that special or force and tech accuracy rating. But unfortunately, it's not very obvious looking at your character sheet without hovering over and looking at some of the details. So I think does that make sense?
Yeah.
Let me try and explain that again. So, when you look at melee and it says like 98%, you need to look at the details of that, and you'll see that melee special attacks are really 109%. They're 10% higher in terms of their base.
Yeah, like force and tech or ranged abilities. Mm-hmm. So, but if you're working for 100%, say you're a Sage or a Sork, you still need to get 100% or 110% for the force attacks, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about.
Because I do know that was a change that they made in the past, where previously Sorks and Sages, they didn't need to worry about accuracy. It was something that they never concerned themselves with because the bosses were designed at that 100%, rather that 110% level. But then they did make Sork Sages need that extra 10% off of their base values. Right. But none of their gear, I think, in 2.0 was actually giving them any accuracy, so they were having to go to other location, or at least none of their comm gear was, right?
I think so. So I guess technically, defense allows you to avoid ranged and melee attacks, and resistance, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Keyboard Ninja, allows you to avoid tech and force attacks. And so I think the change that you're speaking of, Redna, was that they changed the resistance value for bosses.
Right. Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, so, okay, right. So the resistance value on the bosses, and we still don't have for tanks a resistance value, do we? Although armor affects it, right?
No, armor doesn't affect it, but set bonuses do, and certain talents do.
That's right. That's right.
So,
and then, of course, you've got the Force Shroud.
Yeah, and Shroud and Force Barrier, those affect resist. Another thing that now affects resist is explosive fuel for power techs. That increases your resist by 35 overpowered percentage points. So there's fun things like that. Shadows very notably have a 2% quote defense talent in their discipline path. That is in fact actually a 2% defense and resist talent. that is really, really nice. Another example is Blade Barricade for Guardian and Juggernaut tanks, which is the proc from Riposte or Retaliate.
Right.
That proc says it increases defense chance, but it actually also increases resist, and that is really valuable. But in general,
Okay.
In general, resist is very, very, very rare. There's outside of defensive cooldowns, there's almost no effects in the game that add resist chance.
Okay.
And all of this stuff can be seen on your character sheet. It may not be as obvious. You may have to hover over a couple things, but we as characters have a resistance chance as well. You can't really do anything about it, and it's not shown kind of in that overview defense one, although there are some passives that will boost it for specific classes or specs. But all of this stuff that we're talking about can be seen, I guess you could think about it as every boss having a character sheet similar to ours. You would just need to explore all of the character sheet to understand what those different values are.
Yeah. Okay. So that gets us to Surge. Now we know that Surge. I guess this is where the very interesting aspect of the changes to Alacrity could end up affecting Surge, because Alacrity does have some significant value for most classes. But by building Alacrity, you're going to be decreasing Surge. Now, we've been working with an abundance and overabundance of Surge basically in the past, but now DPS classes have to get their accuracy, and they are thinking seriously about Alacrity, and that's going to decrease Surge. What are we doing with Surge at this stage?
Well, so Surge, as we alluded to earlier, Surge has a fantastic rate of return. And rate of return is tied to diminishing return as well, but here it's the more interesting side of it, which is that 1 point of Surge gets you more percentage points than 1 point of Alacrity. Just percentage point to percentage point, right? So because we're working with very tertiary budgets, once you subtract out accuracy, Surge is very, very attractive. Very, very, very attractive. So generally the advice that I've been giving to people, in terms of just like off the back of my hand, here's a rule of thumb that you can use to gear out your DPS, is once you get yourself to the accuracy level that you want, just run a 2-to-1 ratio of Surge to Alacrity right now, right? Surge is just going to help you more than Alacrity will, just because of where we are. Once you start getting your Surge up a lot higher, maybe you might want to start running 1-to-1 or even 1-to-2 with Alacrity starting to take precedence. But where we are right now, our tertiary stat budget without accuracy is just so small that Surge is the most bang for your buck.
So arguably for healers, maybe a 1-to-1, since they don't have to worry about the accuracy?
Yeah, I think so. If anything, maybe even a little bit more Alacrity, depending on what class you are.
Okay. Suggestions then, depending on what class you are. Who would want Alacrity more? How's that?
So, go ahead, Oofalong.
I was going to say, I don't think it's so much that. It's just that you're not getting much more utility or much more benefit from the Surge that you're getting at that level. So it really doesn't. It's not that. It's not like that you're focusing on, hey, I want to do this because I want to get more alacrity. You're doing it because you're not benefiting from the Surge that you're picking up with that 5th or 6th piece having Surge in it.
Okay, yeah, and actually that's a big question too, because you did mention before that baked in naturally, didn't you say Commando and Merc healers have a tremendous amount of Surge? So that's going to make crit more valuable to them, but then would that make Surge less valuable to them?
No, the opposite actually. Yeah. Because stats are additive. So
okay.
It's not just the fact that you end up with more crit and more primary stat, but it's also like if I'm putting 400 points of Surge on my gear and I want to calculate how much that is, if I have a baseline Surge percentage of just 50%, that 400 points is going to be worth X value. If I have a baseline Surge value of, say, 80%, and then I add 400 points of Surge, that Surge is, relatively speaking, adding more damage to me, more healing. So it's substantially more than the X value from the baseline 50%. So this is something that you see with talents just across the board. So it's really, for commandos, Surge is really, really, really attractive. And Alacrity, I don't know, Alacrity also plays a really interesting role, because I don't think that Alacrity reduces the duration of Supercharge. So you actually end up in this really strange spot where, okay, Alacrity is great because you can fit more stuff in your supercharge, but then,